Hi, everybody. Today I'm going to talk about Jesus and Divine Christology, which is the new title by Brant Pitre, published by Erdman's. I want to say thank you to Erdman's for sending me a review copy of this. This is going to be my honest take on this book, but I'll take you through my typical format, which is summarizing the main idea, talking a bit about the research behind it, then the readability of the style, and then finally my general reactions at the end. So let's dive into this one. Jesus and Divine Christology, which is a fairly bland title, I'll say that at the outset, fairly nondescript title, although it does tell you a bit about, what the main idea is about. This is Brant Pitre kind of taking on and responding to what is generally I think it's fair to say this is a scholarly consensus in biblical studies and New Testament studies in particular, or studies in the early church, kind of historical theology. So he's taking on this mainstream mindset that Jesus, the idea that Jesus did not think of himself as divine, and that was something that was developed and kind of retroactively put on him by the earliest generations of the church, particularly as Christological theology developed, up towards the Nicene Creed and such. So that is something that's very commonly touted by someone like a Bart Ehrman, for example. We'll talk about how Jesus saw himself as a human, and that this idea of him being God is something that was put on him as the church developed its own thinking, but does not originate with his self-conception or what he taught. So Brant Pitre is responding to that with a very, very forceful, confident rebuttal, basically. He is making the case that Jesus did, in fact, think of himself as divine, as the divine Messiah, the divine Son of Man, you can get into the Logos terminology, all that stuff, but regardless, Brant Pitre is making the case in this book that Jesus thought of himself as divine, and that is actually the kernel and the root of what would flower in later centuries in kind of Nicene Christology around the Trinity, and concerning the Trinity and concerning the status of Jesus as the Logos and the Son. So he is trying to bust a pretty generally held view in a lot of mainstream scholarship, particularly skeptical scholars, that a lot of more evangelical or conservative scholars will have no problem affirming Jesus' self-conception of divinity, but he is trying to respond directly to kind of the consensus in the scholarly field broadly, not just within evangelicalism or conservative Christian kind of theological instruction. So that's what the book is all about. The book is about saying this is how Jesus, demonstrating from history and a kind of historicity that there's a case to be made that Jesus actually thought of himself as God. Now, how does he do that? I'm going to say a little bit more about that on the main idea before I move on to the other aspects of the review. What he does is he adopts a historical methodology, largely influenced by John Meyer, who is a really well-known kind of historical Jesus scholar, who's since passed away. But he takes a threefold methodology. I really, really like this, and so I want to spend a minute unpacking it. He takes this methodology and he uses alliterative terms of the context, the coherence, and then the consequences of something from the New Testament. So he'll take something like a miracle, attributed to in the New Testament, Jesus walking on the water, for example. There's a section in a chapter on that. And then he'll use this threefold methodology to argue from history whether or not this is evidence that Jesus thought of himself as divine. So he'll start with context. He'll say, is this something that is plausible within the context of Judaism, particularly at the time? So with the walking on water miracle, is this something that other would-be divine figures claimed to have done, or were there claims that others walked on water? So other historical figures like Antiochus Epiphanes, for example, was there an alleged event in which they walked on water, and is that linked to them claiming divine status? And he demonstrates that there is. So in the context, it would make sense that a walking on water miracle would be a divine claim. Then the coherence argument is, does it cohere with other aspects of Christ's ministry, or particularly the Jewish history and ancient Jewish texts, what we call the Old Testament today? And so Jesus walking on water, is that in line with prophetic pronouncements from people like Isaiah, about the revelation of God on earth? and he would demonstrate, in each of these cases, he demonstrates the coherence argument is sound, and he does that with the walking on water miracle. And then finally, before I spend too long on this, the consequences. How did that result in, how did that produce results and consequences for the early church? And so did this event have significant fruit, so to speak, in the claim that produced confidence and claims in the earliest followers of Christ that he was divine. And then he demonstrates that, again, with the walking on water, that is the case. So context, historical context and setting, coherence within Jesus' ministry and Judaism at the time, and then consequences into the early church. And he walks through that threefold methodology for lots of different aspects of Christ's ministry. So I already talked about the miracles. He talks about a handful of miracles. He talks about Jesus' riddles that he speaks in, and kind of he makes the case that Jesus is inviting, in a riddle-like, puzzle-like way, inviting faith and belief in his own divine status. He talks about apocalyptic language and the revealing, especially, also around John the Baptist, and John the Baptist's questions of Jesus' identity is in that chapter. He also talks about the crucifixion. This is a really, really good chapter, I thought, on the specific charges against Christ related to blasphemy. And then again, through the context, the coherence, and the consequences, could a case be made that his crucifixion is actually because of his divine self-claims? Really, really interesting chapter there. And then there's a closing chapter that gets more into some of the historical implications of what all this could mean for kind of re-understanding Christ's claims about himself. So that's the main idea. It's an argument from history. It is an historical argument. So it's not, when he talks about the miracles, for example, he brackets off, the question of whether miracles are possible or not. He brackets that off as kind of a metaphysical, philosophical, prior that the reader will bring to the text, and he is not wading into that debate. He is more so wading into the debate that, given that we have these accounts, can you consider their context, their coherence, and their consequences historically as a responsible historian, and then what does that reveal about the person at the center, namely Christ? Was he claiming divine status for himself or not? Can you argue that from history? So that's what this book is all about. It is a robust, confident, well-researched argument that from history you can make the strong claim that Christ did think of himself as divine in his ministry, and used these events and riddles and whatnot to make that claim, which his followers then believed, and which then carried into the early church. That's what this book's about. So let's move on. The research. This book is researched so well, and I'll say a little bit about why I feel that way. So he's conversant with, I already mentioned Bart Ehrman, but he's conversant with a whole spectrum of scholars. He interacts with some of the Jesus Seminar folks on the more historically skeptical end. He interacts with people on the more conservative end, like N.T. Wright. He interacts with people in the middle, like Paul Fredrickson. He interacts a lot with J.R. Daniel Kirk, particularly his work in A Man Attested by God. But I'm barely talking about one layer. I mean, he talks about older historical scholars. He talks about he interacts with E.P. Sanders directly. So many scholars he interacts with and demonstrates a knowledge of the work. John Mayer, I obviously talked about already. He has a huge influence on this project. But what I love about the research in this book is he will engage in a topic, let's say the miracles of Christ, and he will, in each section, he will say, for example, here are a smattering of direct quotations from historical Jesus scholars that demonstrate the range of opinion on this particular miracle's historicity. And he'll just quote, and then there'll be a footnote at the bottom that'll say, here are other sources you can go to that I didn't have space to quote from that represent this particular view. And then he will also, in each section, he will include an argument that will essentially, or a section that will demonstrate the opposing viewpoint to his. So this is not a straw man argument. This is a very good example of good scholarship that gives the best kind of accounting of an opposing view. And so those who do not think certain accounts are historically reliable, or do not think they are in any way have any implications for Jesus' divine self-conception, he will give them a section in each chapter and say, here are the counter-arguments to the view I'm about to defend. Here are the counter-arguments to why Jesus' apocalyptic thunderbolt, is not a revealing of his own self, divinity. And he gives them, I don't think he gives them short shrift. I think he gives them space to those views to be represented. And so it's just from a research angle, it's a really robust argument, and it interacts with such a wide range of scholars. I will say I was a little surprised he doesn't interact with someone like John Dominic Crossan very much directly. So there you could come up with some names that don't show up that much. But as a whole, I was really blown away by the mastery of a broad range of historical research that Brant Pitre demonstrates in this book. And I was surprised. Like there are chapters where he'll talk about a parable of Jesus, or he'll talk about a miracle of Jesus, and he'll say, it's surprising how many historical Jesus volumes do not interact with this, or just ignore this episode in the Gospels. And then in the footnote, he'll list all these scholars, people like Bart Ehrman, for example, who just don't talk about the issue that he's discussing in this book. And it's really surprising. Even someone on a conservative end like N.T. Wright sometimes will be down there. Like they just don't talk about certain episodes in the Gospels that Brant Pitre are going to have really strong implications for the concept of, Jesus' own self-conception of divinity. It's really surprising. Like there's a lot of insights just in the research in this book, which is one reason why I think it's so valuable. But I'm going to move on to the next section. The next question with more, this is more academic project, deeply researched, but is it readable? That's always a question with these books. And this one, I am very, very, very pleased to say it's super readable. I devoured this book because I was so interested in it. I will say on the readability front, it's not particularly stylistically interesting. I will say that. There's no flourishes, there's no muscular vocabulary demonstrated in the writing, but it is extraordinarily clear and very well organized. Each chapter has a rhythm to it. Each chapter has kind of a pattern to how he engages with the skeptics, how he defends his views, how he brings in other sources and other quotations. There's a rhythm to the reading experience that makes it very easy to follow, and it's also just very clearly and straightforwardly written, which I found very refreshing, kind of in something that's so deeply researched. So I found it, as someone who is very interested in the subject at hand and has a decent a range of reading in the scholars he's interacting with, I found it extremely readable, and because it's so straightforward, I just kept pushing through it and kept kind of compulsively moving ahead because I was super interested in each. I'd finish a chapter on the miracles, and then I'd see that he was going to be talking about some apocalyptic parables, and I was really interested to see where he was going with each chapter. So I found it super readable, but hopefully me talking through that will help you calibrate as to whether or not you would find this readable. If you're not particularly interested in historical research, historical Jesus studies, I don't know that this one's really going to get you interested, but if you're already there, this is such a clear, well-organized argument. You're going to get into it. I feel pretty confident saying that. And then finally, my reaction. So I've been very positive throughout this whole review. I really loved this book a lot, more than I expected to. The title is very bland. I had some familiarity with Pitre. I really respect his. Particularly, he has a reputation for being someone who knows the Jewish context and the Jewish background of Jesus' ministry really well. So I came in kind of with some positive, associations with him as a scholar. But my goodness, I loved this book. I think as a kind of a counter voice to a lot of the popular narratives about how Jesus, in Bart Ehrman's words, how Jesus became God, that trajectory, that narrative that Jesus didn't think of himself as God, but his followers did, and that was a development over time. This is a really, really profound countervoice to that argument, and it's from history. It's from historiography. It's from that angle. It is not making philosophical or metaphysical arguments. Obviously, he brings theological and metaphysical claims, but he's not primarily arguing from that angle. He's arguing from history as a responsible historian should make arguments. He's very clear with the methodology from the outset, and he follows that methodology throughout the whole thing, that threefold context, coherence, and consequences. It's very easy to remember. It's very easy to get a handle on. And so all that's super positive, but I will give a couple more specific examples of ways that he actually like shifted my paradigm on a few things. So one very small example is when he talks about Christ's controversial so-called hard saying about if you don't hate your mother and father, you can't follow me, without kind of being that divisive language about hating your mother and father in order to follow him, right? He talks about that episode, and I had never considered that being a claim to divinity before reading this book. But Brant Pitre argues quite compellingly that essentially what Jesus is saying there is he is taking on the way the Ten Commandments are kind of representing a priority of love towards God and an honoring of father and mother. That's right in the Ten Commandments. And so given the deep historical context of Judaism at the time, for him to put devotion to him above the command from God to honor your father and mother is, Brant Pitre argues, and he argues at much more depth than what I'm repeating here, he argues that it is in itself a divine claim. Like, that in itself is evidence that Jesus knew himself to be the incarnate second member of the Godhead, and was inviting devotion to him equal to devotion to God, which was above mother and father. That's super, super interesting, and that's not a way I've really thought about that particular episode from the Gospels. I already talked about the walking on water incident a little bit. That one was also really, really intriguing, contextualizing it in other events at the time and other people like Antiochus, making divine claims. Also, I'll circle back to the crucifixion chapter. For me, I think that is one of the strongest chapters in a very strong book overall, and I think he makes a very, very compelling case that shifted a little bit of my own paradigm around what the pressure point was that actually resulted in Jesus' historic crucifixion, which is something that even the most skeptical scholars, like Bart Ehrman, for example, will affirm that Jesus was crucified by Pontius Pilate. That's generally not a negotiated historical event, but Brant Pitre presses into the why behind that received and accepted historical event. And he makes a very strong case that it was not, for example, about him raising Lazarus. It was not, for example, more commonly is argued, it was, people argue that he was crucified because of the temple incident and because of his threatening of the temple system and the temple protest. Brant Pitre makes very strong argument that that's not ultimately what's going on there. And he also pushes back on, for example, there are arguments about that the historicity of the dialogue between Jesus and Pilate can't be relied on, for example, because there wouldn't have been eyewitnesses there that wrote it down. He pushes back on all of that stuff from really careful history, not from theological or metaphysical or kind of like dogmatic claims. He argues from history and pushes back on lots of the counter arguments. And I just thought that chapter was a huge triumph. I think this book overall is a great, wonderful success, a wonderful argument, but that chapter in particular is like the crown jewel of the book, in my opinion, on the crucifixion and how the divine self-claims were such that Jesus was considered a blasphemer, and that is ultimately, along with all the other factors that contributed to the tension and the angst of the time, but ultimately the divine self-claims are what resulted in his crucifixion. I just think it's a powerful argument, and I love that he does it rigorously from history with a clear methodology that's organized and easy to follow. So yeah, this gets high recommendations from me. I absolutely loved this book by Brant Pitre, Jesus and Divine Christology, published by Erdmans. If you are someone who's deep in historical Jesus interest, especially if you read a lot of the skeptical scholars, Jesus Seminar folks, Ehrman, others, run, don't walk to get this book. And I think if nothing else, if it doesn't convince you, it's at least a responsible, scholarly, extraordinarily well-researched and clearly presented counter-voice to a lot of what's kind of taken for granted when it comes to understanding who Christ was and who he claimed himself to be and how that's preserved in the accounts that we have in the Gospels. So, yeah, really love this book. Very happy, very, very happy to encourage people to check it out on this channel. So there you go. Those are my thoughts. As always, thank you for taking a few minutes to watch.